Our first speaker is Nick Whiting, and I'm thrilled to have him give the first lecture of the first VR class. And so Nick is one of the lead developers at Epic Games. And their company that does gaming engines, like the Unreal Engine is the one that they developed, which is super awesome, as well as lots of games. And they've also recently gotten into VR. So Oculus is cool, as you all know, and perhaps the coolest thing on Oculus right now is something called Bullet Train, which I think you'll all get a chance to try. But it's one of the most compelling demos in VR right now, and it's one of the first to use the Oculus controllers. And Nick was the lead developer on this project. And what's amazing about it is that they did it in 10 weeks, which is perfect because you guys also have 10 weeks in your project. So you should think of this as representative of the kinds of things that you should try to do. All right, Nick.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm kind of humbled to be speaking to you guys, especially with the lineup of speakers that you guys have managed to get, especially Michael Abrash. If you don't miss one lecture, don't miss Michael Abrash's lecture, because he was actually the one that turned my after-hours efforts at Epic, where I was just kind of churning on this cool little toy that I got, into a legitimate VR program. It was Michael Abrash meeting with our CEO, Tim Sweeney, that really sold him on the promise and the potential of VR. And he's an amazing speaker, so please, 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 whatever you do, go see Michael Abrash. So, as he said, I'm Nick Whiting. I kind of stumbled into VR accidentally. I knew some of the Oculus founders from their previous company, and about 3 years ago they said, hey, we got this crazy kind of duct-taped device that lets you see into another world, but we don't have any content for it. You guys have a lot of content because you make games. Do you want to kind of hook your stuff up with our stuff and see where it goes? And so I said, yeah. And so after my normal 12-hour day job, I worked another 8-hour day job and started the Epic VR department. So just to give you kind of a taste of what we do, Bullet Train, the project you mentioned, has anybody heard of Bullet Train or tried Bullet Train? Have you tried Bullet Train?
No, but I hope volunteer.
Sounds good. So I'll give you a quick video, basically, of the experience of Bullet Train, which is using the Oculus VR headset and, like you said, the motion controller. So this was our first attempt at making what we call fully immersive experience, where you can interact with the world as opposed to just being a passive observer. And hopefully it all works. No sound.
Pulling into the rail station. Be alert. The enemy will be waiting for you. Freeze! Grab and throw your
So that's kind of a brief video of Bullet Train. Of course, with VR, it's much better to experience it and be in the action, but that kind of gives you an idea of what we were going for, kind of playing off of kind of campy sci-fi and campy 80s action movies and a bit of the Matrix kind of thrown in. But like you said, we did that in 10 weeks with a team of 2 for about 4 of those weeks, and then kind of scaled up to a team of 10 for about 6 of the weeks. So we run very, very lean, so I thought some of the stuff I would cover was our team structure and how we develop these demos on such a shoestring budget, the kind of demo creation process, which we adapted from our game creation process, and then the majority of the lecture is actually going to be covering what I call the most important secret in VR, but we'll have to wait a little bit to see what it is. So at Epic, we run super lean. Like I said, I started this about 3 years ago, and it was just me after hours, and I kind of co-opted one other person's time a little bit. We kind of scrappily put together a couple demos. We made about 6 of them so far. Bullet Train is kind of the culmination of those. But for most of the time that we've been making these demos, the equation that we use for putting them together is 1 programmer, 1 designer, as many borrowed resources as we can get through beer and whiskey donations. Anywhere between 4 and 10 weeks, depending on the thing, and of course, lots of blood, sweat, and many, many, many tears. Because it's hard work, and there's unique challenges to VR that I'll get into in a second. But the only way we can make that work and create these demos on such a tight time frame is that we really try to make development a democracy. Everybody has an equal role in it. Nobody can block another person, and everybody kind of contributes continually to the development and the refinement of the demos. So to do that, there's kind of a few key points. We have regular meetings every day. As soon as we can get something up and running, in the engine we have people play test it every day, sometimes twice a day. We all get around. Half the team is actually in North Carolina, and half the team is here in Bellevue. So we have a video link between us, and we go through and play the demo and just call out stuff that we think needs improvement. Also, everyone is a programmer, even the designers that don't come from a programming background. In UE4, there's something called Blueprint, which was my day job before doing VR, which is a visual scripting language. So it's basically making flowcharts to define behavior. So when I hit something, I want to play an effect, and I want to decrease the player's health. So we try to make everybody able to use that thing and develop a common language that both the designers and the programmers on the project can speak. And then finally, we reuse, buy, and adapt any content we can, because content creation is by far the most expensive part of making the demo. So to get into a little more detail about the regular meetings, like I said, we have playtest coming twice a day, and our playtest loop goes something like this. We implement a feature, so grabbing bullets and throwing them back, picking up guns, whatever it is. We playtest the crap out of it, because you can only get that feedback through actually using it. Your ideas rarely kind of match up with how well you think they're going to be. And we listen for the disappointment in their voices. So whenever the player's like, oh, I messed up, or that was almost cool, we kind of make a note of that and then go to 10 and kind of refine that feature. So it's very simple. It's very kind of, software development 101, but the key is really you have to do it every day, much more often than you necessarily would when you're making an application. So when you're gathering that feedback, the most important thing is you can't just ask people, what did you think? What did you feel? Because a lot of the times people don't tell you, or they don't remember. They're so overwhelmed with kind of the experience that they don't remember what they thought was cool or what they thought was lame. So what we do is we kind of try to pay very close attention to the facial expressions and other kind of nonverbal cues. Body language, you can see them frown, you can hear exasperated sighs. Swearing is also a good indicator of either good or bad. The other thing we try to do is, we play test with the team, but you kind of get used to your own product and you start to see past the flaws, or you start ignoring them. So it's very, very important to kind of test with a variety of people, and that includes young people, old people, male, female. Everybody has very different proclivities and physiological sensitivities in VR, so you really have to make sure you're not just testing with the same set of people, but you're kind of testing with a variety of people with a variety of levels of experience. And finally, the thing that we try not to do is when we're testing out a new feature, we try not to bias the subjects. We let them discover the functionality. So we don't say, here, I want you to pick up the gun and I want you to pull back the slide on it and tell me how it feels, because then they're going to be paying too much attention to it. You want to see their natural reaction and their kind of initial reaction. That's the secret to kind of getting a polished demo out of it. So moving on to everybody being a programmer, this is kind of the traditional workflow. If you imagine the FedEx delivery man delivering a TV, being the programmer, being a feature. We used to just kind of throw it over the fence and then walk away, and that was it. When you only have 10 weeks, that's really not a tenable track, because there's so much iteration and refinement that has to go on. So we can't afford to do that. So at Epic, this is the blueprints I mentioned before. It's kind of a very flowcharty, anybody can understand the logical flow of it. And we make everybody into a programmer, because everybody we found on our team can make these simple logic diagrams to make very basic behaviors. And it kind of becomes a language that both the programmers and the designers can both speak. So while not everybody's a programmer by trade, everyone occasionally, even non-programmers, have good ideas. So we want to make sure that they aren't blocked waiting for somebody to throw a feature over the fence. We want them to be able to prototype it, at least in some form, without waiting for a programmer. So some other things, if you don't have something like visual programming languages, you don't have to make everybody a programmer necessarily, but at least give them a sandbox to play with new ideas, because as I mentioned, your first idea kind of rarely works out as you expect it to. So giving people a sandbox where they can try things, we call it throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. Basically, whatever you can take to allow everybody on your team to contribute at all times and not be blocked on anybody else, reducing that is the key to making a demo quickly. And on the topic, like I said, content development is the most expensive stuff. So in almost all of the demos that we've done, we've stolen content from other demos and games that we've made, other people's side projects. You'd be surprised how amenable they are to that. and other people's demos with permission, of course, at Epic. So, but if you don't have a kind of that stockpile of content to draw on, there's a lot of other good places to draw. You guys are going to be using Unity, which is the other engine, so the Epic example content probably isn't for you, but Unity has a great marketplace where you can buy assets and whatnot. I would highly, highly recommend just buying as much as you can and make a toy box, basically, that you can play around with, because the more stuff you can get to kind of try and iterate as quickly as possible, the better. And also TurboSquid is a great resource. That's where we buy most of our assets for the demos. For actually creating the demos, we base it off of kind of our traditional game creation pipeline, which looks a little something like this. You have the prototyping phase, and then we follow that by what we call white boxing, is where we kind of get a feel for the level with low resolution assets. We go into production, which is where we refine it and build out the look, and then we do the polish phase at the end, where we're just kind of iterating on the final 10 to 20% of the gameplay to make it feel really good. So in the prototype phase, we want to kind of try out as many ideas as possible and figure out which ones have the most potential, because every demo that we've done, the first idea never, ever works out. Some of them fail more spectacularly than others, but this is usually how it goes. So, I got a good idea, we're running with it, we try it, get up, and run into the wall. Like that. But we found that basically mitigating the cost of failure is the key. So we try to fail as early as possible by trying as many things as possible in kind of just a roughed out prototype way, and then see what works. And then we very rarely actually go with our first idea. So after we kind of prototype things, we go to what's called the white boxing phase. So this is where we kind of flesh out the experience itself, which is very simple: cubes, spheres, nothing high resolution at all. I mean, at this point we do what's called kit bashing, where we take little bits and pieces from other models and just kind of combine them into something that looks vaguely like what we want, and then try to use that to suss out the gameplay ideas. So for Bullet Train, you saw what it looked like before. This is what it looked like in the white boxing phase. These guns are just kind of cubes and stuff that people threw together. We stole a mannequin asset from one of our animation demos. And basically this was just to test out functionality. Is it fun to shoot guns? What guns are fun to shoot? And we don't refine it very far from there. This is the kind of final end of the white boxing phase, where it's just kind of an alley that's lit, but again, no real time has been spent on this content. And this really allows you to kind of test out and get the feel of it before you invest the time in making it actually look good. So for the production, you kind of understand what you're building from the prototyping phase and the white boxing phase, and you're just kind of filling in the look. And this is kind of the most boring part, because you're just churning out a list of assets and then putting them in. So in Bullet Train, this is where we went from the white box phase to something that looked a little bit like this. None of these assets are close to final, but it kind of is just kind of step by step, put in the chairs, put in the train tracks, put in all the little elements that make it look like a polished experience. And then in the final phase, you can never have enough polish time. So we try to, we call it the last 10%, but it actually is probably the last 50%. We're just kind of continually refining the feel and the look of things after we have them all blocked out. So we kind of modify the playtest loop at this point, and instead of implement a feature, we implement a fix, and then see how people react to it. And then we iterate on that as long as possible, and that's where the daily playtests really come into play. So that's kind of the overview of how we make this stuff, but now I'm going to kind of get into what we call the most important secret in VR, which isn't really that secret or that surprising, but it's cheat all the time. So the best thing you can do with VR is kind of rip other stuff off, take ideas other people have implemented, and talk with them, see what succeeded, see what failed, and use as much kind of smoke and mirrors as you can muster. So basically, if you can look at another project and see what succeeded, what failed, and understand that, you don't have to waste the time yourself in the prototyping phase. And that's really what we do at Epic, is we look at other people that have done cool mechanics or cool things in VR and try to make them our own and build the next step on top of that. So with that, the kind of majority of the rest of the lecture I want to do is just kind of take you through some of the stuff we've made and how we've really messed it up, and then how we kind of got some salvageable lessons from that. And with VR, like I said, a lot of things aren't necessarily intuitive results. There's a lot of stuff we kind of stumbled into that I wish I would have known 3 years ago when we started into this. So I'm going to kind of go over just a post-mortem, if you would, of some of the demos that we made. The first one we did was called Elemental VR, and this was for the Oculus Rift HD prototype about 3 years ago. And basically, for this one, we just completely ripped off a tech demo that we had made for Unreal Engine 4. It's kind of a big castle scene, and we just wanted the player just to be able to walk around and look around in VR. And this was really when not a lot of people at all had ever used an Oculus. It was brand new. They hadn't released the dev kits yet. So it was very new to a lot of people. And the first thing we did was we had the game moving at kind of game speed, which is much faster than people move in real life. It's about 4 times faster than people move in real life. And we found that in VR, there's a thing called simulator sickness, where if you're doing things like you do in a game or exaggerating real movement and doing stuff that humans aren't actually used to doing, it tends to make people really, really sick. So the first thing we did was we cut down the movement speed to about 1/3 of what our normal movement speed was. And once you did that, people were much more comfortable in there. They didn't feel as nauseous. But the other thing that we happened upon once we cut down the movement speed was there was these kind of vertical staircases. And as soon as people would go up the staircase, it would be like that feeling you get on a roller coaster when you start to go up or down a hill. Your stomach would just kind of drop, and then people would feel really uncomfortable. So we kind of accidentally happened upon the solution to that, which was, it's kind of hard to see with the lights on, but this is actually the bottom of a staircase looking up at a 45-degree angle. Thank you. Like this. We were changing the lighting, and we made that upper area a lot brighter than it was previously. Previously, the stairway was really well illuminated, and that was basically the same luminance as the other stairwell. But when we gave people a light to focus on, they naturally kind of moved their head up and looked towards the light as they were walking through there. And once we found out kind of accidentally that when people look in the direction that they want to go, they don't have that kind of sinking pit feeling. So we tried to visually encourage people to look in the direction that they're going to be traveling, and that helped out with things like the staircase. One thing that was completely unintentional that the guys at Oculus that were demoing this found is they usually recommend against vertical movement, but one of the biggest things that they found was fun for people was what they call volcano skiing. And that was, the castle was built on the side of this volcano, and so one of the guys kicked it into debug mode and flew up to the top of the volcano and then pretended to ski down in virtual reality. And we were expecting that would just be a barf factory, basically. But as long as they angled you down and told you to look down at the end of the slope, people actually, that was their favorite part of the demo, and it was completely unintended. We didn't even try it before it went out to the show floor, so that was kind of a late discovery for us. One of the things that was another happy accident was in some of the areas of the castle, the roof had broken out, and there's these kind of snowflakes fluttering around. And they kind of created a volume around you where you had snowflakes falling, and there was a lot of what we call near-field things, which are kind of right up in your face. And we discovered that in VR, those are really compelling because they really add a sense of depth to the scene. If you have things that are only kind of far away, you don't really get a sense of how far away things are or a sense of the space and the scale of it. But when you have a lot of things near to your head, when you rotate, those things move a lot more in what's called parallaxing. And that gives humans a lot better sense of depth. So those areas that had the snowflakes actually kind of were the most interesting areas for a lot of people because that's where they truly had a sense of depth. And another thing that we added that was just somebody messing around, actually, and this kind of goes back to nobody has a bad idea, is what we call the magic missile, which is basically just a blob of little particles and shiny lights that looks like a little magic fireball flying around, and it bounces around like a bouncy ball around the castle. And one of the things that we noticed is that a lot of people that haven't tried VR tend to treat VR like a TV screen. You know, we're very conditioned to sitting on our couches and looking at a screen that's about 2 meters in front of us, and you don't look around the room because there's nothing to see. But when you're in VR, the coolest thing is that you can look around and see the entire space, but people weren't doing it. So we added this bouncy ball, and it shot around, and as soon as it was out there, we had this little very annoying buzz saw sound, so it would go around, and people were naturally kind of attracted to it. The spatialized sound encouraged people to kind of look around and see the environment. And that was actually the first moment that people realized they could look around in VR. It was kind of broke them of the habit of staring forward at a TV screen to something where they could look around and discover the environment. So that was kind of where we learned that spatialized audio was really key. It's not just the visual experience, it's also the audio experience, can really add a lot to it. The next demo we did, what we called strategy VR, and it's kind of a study in scales. This was for the first time the Oculus had positional tracking. So the first Oculus, you could tell when you rotated your head like that, but it couldn't tell when you moved side to side or up and down. And so Oculus wanted a demo where we could try to encourage people to look around and actually move their head physically. So what we decided to do was take some of the content from the previous demo we did, the Elemental VR, and then make a really small kind of tabletop game down here that had a lot of little fine details in it. And that was to try to encourage people to kind of lean in for a closer look and then kind of realize that they could actually lean in. So we decided that the measure of success here would be if somebody actually leaned in far enough that they smacked their head on the table. And in one of the press interviews, somebody actually did that, and that's when we realized it was kind of a successful idea. Because the content was compelling enough that people did want to look down and get their head in there, and people realized they could do something without us kind of directly telling them they could do something. Because discovering that for yourself is actually a lot more fun than being told to do something. So one of the problems with that, though, is the Oculus is optically tracked. So there's a camera out in front of you that helps with the tracking movement of that, so you can do drift correction and get positional tracking. So the problem with that is, though, if you go out of the frustum of the camera where it can't see, it can no longer do that positional tracking. So we needed to kind of alert the user that was happening, and then encourage them to kind of bring themselves back up to center where the camera frustum was. So the first idea we had was like, hey, let's just throw a big arrow in there. And it worked. You know, people would move out of the tracking frustum and they'd have a big arrow in their face that says, move back this way. And they would do it, but it kind of pulled them out of the experience. Then part of the magic of VR is just kind of feeling like you're there. When you have a big sci-fi arrow in front of you, it kind of detracts from that. So the next thing we did is we drew the camera frustum. If you can imagine these red lines coming out as the view place of the camera. When you got close to one of the walls, we would actually kind of draw those walls. And people are naturally kind of uncomfortable with their face very close to something. And that also kind of encouraged them to kind of sit back up. But it had the same sort of problem where it kind of popped people out of the experience. So we randomly kind of hit upon this idea of doing what we call desaturating the scene. And desaturating basically just means turn it black and white. So when the camera lost tracking, the scene would desaturate and go black and white, and people would be like, what happened? And sit back up. And they would naturally be back in the frustum of the camera. And it was a really kind of nice, natural way. It wasn't visually distracting. And it encouraged people to do the right behavior without kind of telling them directly. So one of the things that we learned in the last demo was that the snowflakes and that kind of volume of particles was very helpful to encouraging people to get a sense of depth and presence in there. So we decided we were going to add these little dust particles floating around. And at first we thought it would be cool, let's add some little ambient motion to them like this. But kind of going back to the simulator sickness problem, we noticed that when the dust motes were moving around, people felt like they were kind of floating on a ship, and it made a lot of people really, really uncomfortable. So they kind of had the intended effect of letting people feel like they were in a 3D space, but we slowed down the motion and made them very kind of transparent so that people would not be sick or feel like they're drifting at sea during it. So both those demos were made in about 3 weeks. It was very experimental, and we kind of hoped for the best. But the next one we did was called Couch Nights, and this was when Oculus released the DK2 headset, when you saw earlier. And really what they wanted for that was a social experience where you'd have two people in the same shared space, and you could see the other person's body language. So since you could track the Oculus, we could also replicate the movement. So if I'm sitting here, leaning forward, back, left, and right, we wanted to have some representation of that in the game. So basically the goals of this project were kind of to take that player motion and map it to an in-game avatar so you can have a shared social experience, and do that over a network. And we wanted, since a lot of people hadn't actually tried VR, we wanted to have a competitive, simple experience, but we didn't want to make it overwhelming. We didn't want people to have to be familiar with games in order to have fun in it. So with those kind of goals in mind, what I said about our initial ideas never actually working out, this is kind of the best case study of that. Couch Nights really didn't start out anything like Couch Nights. So before Couch Nights, this was another tech demo that we did for Unreal Engine 3, actually, our previous generation. And since we were looking to beg, borrow, or steal any content that we could, we were like, hey, this is a guy, we can use him as our in-game representation for the player. And so we said, okay, let's sit him in a chair, and then we'll use the tracked head of the player to kind of get him to move around forward, back, left, and right. And it looked pretty good, actually. You know, you could tell that there's another human on the other side reacting. He could move left, right, kind of everything that you can do while sitting down in a chair. But the problem was we didn't have any way to track the hands. So you looked down, and your hands were just kind of dead, even though your hands in the real world were moving around. And that was fundamentally unnerving to people. It really, really creeped them out. People were like, my hands are dead. People would start to get mild panic attacks. And it was really disturbing. So we're like, how do we get around this? And so the first thing we thought was, hey, let's do an interrogation scene, right? Everybody likes to be interrogated. But the goal of that was we wanted to put their hands behind their back. So we figured they were out of sight, out of mind. And when we prototyped that, it worked. If you have the hands behind the back, people didn't notice that they weren't there, and they didn't get creeped out. The legs were okay because the person was kind of sitting in the chair already, so that legs were roughly in the same position, but they couldn't see the hands. And so we said, hey, Oculus, we're going to show this demo of you being interrogated with another human in there. And they're like, that might be a little too intense for people at the Game Developers Conference. So we scrapped that. At that point, we had done 3 weeks of development into it, so it was painful to go back. So kind of went back to the drawing board, and we decided another guy had a personal project he was working on where he made this little kind of action figure cartoon night girl in kind of an old school Zelda style dungeon. And so we're like, hey, what if we kind of simplified this and made it, these toys kind of came to life in your apartment. You're sitting in the apartment with another player on another couch, and then you kind of play this action figure come to life game. And that was kind of cool to us because virtual reality is all about doing things that you can't actually do in reality. And so it kind of had a nice blend of fantasy while keeping the project goal of being able to see another person interacting there with you. So we still had the problem of the arms, but we kind of figured, what if we could, like the legs were sitting there in the position that the real human was sitting in, what if we gave the player something to hold on so that their hands would roughly be in the same place? So because they were kind of playing a game in this apartment, we threw a game controller that the player would actually be holding into the player's hands. And with that, the hands were roughly in the same position that they were in real life, and people no longer felt that they had dead cadaver hands in front of them. So that was our first experience with what's called proprioception, which is kind of your body's ability to know where it is, even if it can't actually see it. So if I close my eyes, I know where my hands are. They're out in front of me, they're out to my side. And I can tell that because of, my body's ability to sense where it is. That's proprioception. So one of the key things we learned with that was that we really have to take a lot of care to make sure that what we do in VR matches up with what's happening in the physical world. And this is kind of what we did for replicating the motion. As I said, there was 2 players, and we wanted to be able to kind of have that body language communicated between the 2 of them. So what we did was we assumed that the player was sitting in the chair, and that was a stationary point. And then we knew where the HMD was because we had positional tracking data. So we did an inverse kinematic chain, which is kind of an animation technique where we just say, we know where this is, figure out where the rest of this body is. And so you can kind of move forward, left, right, up and down. And that was actually really compelling. One of the most magical experiences we had developing this, it was me in Bellevue and then my designer cohort in North Carolina. The first time we had that hooked up, we didn't actually realize it was working. And we were playtesting the game, the actual little mini game where you're fighting the Zelda characters. And I looked over and I saw the other character kind of leaning forward like that, trying to observe it. And I looked over at him, and then he kind of looked back at me, and he gave me this like, "What's up, bro?" nod. It was so stupid, but it was so magical because even with that kind of simple reaction, I could tell that it was a living being on the other side of that. And even though it was very low fidelity and that looked nothing like the guy on the other side, it was really kind of cool just to have that shared sense of presence in there. The unfortunate thing was this was the only character model that we had, and as you can see, he's kind of thugging. He's got tattoos on the back of his head and on his neck. He's got a skull ring and stuff on there, but it was what we had to work with. And we found that through testing, even though it was too late to change it, a lot of people really didn't like being in a confined area that they couldn't escape from this guy and sitting right next to him. They felt just kind of profoundly uncomfortable. Like, I wouldn't want to sit next to this guy in real life. Why am I forced to sit here in an apartment with this guy in virtual reality? So that was something we kind of had to live with, but in the future we were much, much more careful with the character models that we picked. On the converse side, though, the little action figures that came to life, people really, really bonded with them. Have you guys heard of the Uncanny Valley? Do you know what that is? Anybody? Yeah, you guys do, of course. But basically that's kind of the theory that the closer and closer you get to a photorealistic thing, the more and more obvious that it's not alive it becomes to humans. We're very kind of conditioned to facial movements and micro expressions and the details of the human face. So when you get something that's close but not quite there, people actually tend to think it's not alive or a cadaver or something, and it freaks people out. But the way to get around that is to kind of be non-photorealistic. This is a very stylized, cartoony, Pixar, for lack of a better term, character. And we found that people actually bonded with this character a lot more, and it was a lot easier to make this character. It was much lower fidelity, but people had a great time with her. She had these little facial expressions. So when she won, she kind of smiled. She did a little dance and stuck her sword up in the air. When she got hit, she frowned, and people felt really bad for her. And people really enjoyed playing with her more than actually playing the game. So we're like, hey, if it works for her, maybe it'll work for the thuggin' dude sitting next to you. So we had a great idea that was like, why don't we just give this guy 3 facial expressions? Because at the beginning, his face didn't animate at all. He just had this kind of stoic, neutral expression the whole time. So like, what if we had a happy face for when you got a point and a sad face for when he was getting beaten? And it kind of really backfired in our face because what people noticed was when he was just having this neutral expression, people didn't notice his face at all. But when he started reacting by smiling and frowning, they noticed his lack of expression all the other times in there. So by trying to increase the fidelity of the experience, we actually took a step backwards because people didn't realize before that he didn't have facial expressions, but it was immediately obvious after we added 2 facial expressions that the rest of the time he was just dead in the face. So that's what we ended up with at Couch Nights. It is what it is. It was about a 6-week project. So with those lessons learned, we moved on to the next project, which was called Showdown. So this was kind of a scene where it's purely passive. You're moving through a scene in a straight line in kind of slow motion Matrix style up to the boss at the end. And this one's free on the internet, so you guys can download it, check it out, and play around with it if you want.
It's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. So this one had really, really limited constraints, actually. We had about only 5 weeks to complete the content. It was me and my designer buddy for most of the work, and this was actually the first time Oculus had done a 90 frames a second headset, which in terms of processing power is really, really hard to get to. So it was an unknown headset. We didn't even have a prototype till the very end, so we didn't know what we were working with. And we had to get it to 90 hertz, and it had to look better because our exec team was like, it's got to be beautiful. To sell engines, basically. So we kind of got down to brainstorming and realized with the short time frame, we had to rip off even more of our tech demos. That's from a demo we called Infiltrator that came out, I think 2 years ago now. And then the street scene, that Owen character from the Couch Nights demo, the original one, this is the scene that he came from. It's kind of a gritty New York thing. So we kind of took those two, mashed them together, and got the content for that. But since we were mostly reusing the content, we wanted to kind of push the bar a little bit. We wanted to focus on 2 new aspects to kind of make the demo look great, because we had previously avoided them. A lot of the things we do in games just don't translate to VR, and 2 of those things are shadows and explosions. Shadows because they're too computationally expensive in a lot of cases, and explosions because we usually fake those by putting a bunch of renders of an explosion on 2D geometry to make it look like a 3D explosion. And that works great when you're playing a video game on a TV. But when you're in VR, they just kind of look like sheets. So we focused on basically throwing a bunch of geometry at it and messing around to limiting degrees of success. I mean, it looks all right in game, but this was really, we decided this time to blow our budget on making that look cool. And the shadows were completely faked. We actually used a technique that most people used on the PlayStation 2 to give you an idea how far back that goes. Where we just actually pre-rendered the shadow and then projected it onto a surface rather than doing it at runtime. So all those efforts that we did had something in common, and that was that we adapted the content from other demos. So with Bullet Train, we had something new with the motion controllers, and we wanted to create something new on the content side. So this was released at Oculus Connect last year, in last September, and it was kind of our first foray into what is only possible in VR. Using motion controls. We really wanted to put the player in the scene and let them interact, because all those other demos were mostly passive. You were kind of looking around and you didn't have much control over the environment. So we wanted to really kind of raise the bar on that. For the design constraints, the biggest thing is they wanted us to kind of raise the visual bar and make it look better than Showdown. Since we were adapting content, it could only look so good, and we were making content fresh this time, it could look a lot better. One of the other things is they really wanted an interesting environment and architecture, because as a business goal, they wanted to show the potential of VR for architectural visualization and architects to use. So we wanted to have a scene that looked like something that people would kind of pay attention to if they were in the professional architecture field. And adding the motion controllers, we wanted to see what does it mean now that people can interact and pick up things in VR. And kind of finally, we just wanted to do what we call dogfooding the engine, which is basically use the product we make to actually make a product and see where the shortcomings were, feel the pain of actually going through the process and make improvements to fix that up. The other constraints were that they wouldn't let us make it a sequel to Showdown, so we had to do something creatively new. On all the gameplay had to be something that could only be done with a motion controller. We didn't want something that you could use a traditional gamepad for. We wanted to really base the people in the experience. So we asked ourselves, what should we do? We had 6 weeks to kind of flesh out the architecture part of it, and the interesting thing was we had a new employee from the film industry. He'd never actually made games before or game content, so he was fresh into the industry. He had no kind of prior experience with it, so we had to do something that was architecturally simple enough that he could kind of build content around it very, very fast. And then we wanted to also have kind of multiple location advantages to show off the architecture of the environment. So when we're looking at kind of real-world reference in that the prototyping phase, we looked at the Raleigh-Durham International Airport just because it has this kind of cool glass and wood architecture for it, and it's kind of a big open space. And also European train stations, because we wanted a space where we could have a flying boss. That was one of the things that we just thought was a cool idea. So we needed something that had a big open kind of area for it to play around in. So those are kind of some of the reference points that we had, and this is what we came up with. This is that early production photo. You can see it's kind of still just shelled out, but it's got the wood and glass elements of the Raleigh-Durham International Airport, along with the kind of big archways of the European train station. So while the majority of these assets were kind of custom built for Bullet Train, we did buy some of the assets and spin them up just because of the time constraints. The train exterior in there, we kind of took and remodeled and retextured a little bit. The weapons pack, all the guns we shot were bought off of our marketplace. We didn't make those in-house. And the character that you're shooting is kind of a reskinned version of one of the guys from our other demo. So we got it to kind of, the environment to look good, but we also had to kind of prototype the gameplay. You know, what does it mean to have a motion controller? What's it mean to shoot something in VR? Kind of the first option we went was what we called Hogan's Alley. This is, again, the kind of white boxing phase of things where all it is a couple of boxes, there's some enemies that run up from the back, and then just the guns here. And we use that really to just test out the ideas. You know, how do you hold the gun? You know, do we make it automatic? Do we make you have to like cock the gun to shoot it? All those sorts of things we kind of beat out in this very low fidelity environment. And it was fun. People that used it, you know, had a good time, but it kind of got a little bit boring because in this demo, you were kind of staying in the same place. You didn't get to move at all, and that kind of defeated a lot of the purpose of being in VR. You kind of have a static set, and it just wasn't super interesting. So we kind of said, okay, we learned some stuff about the guns there. Let's try some other ideas. The second option we had, thought we had, was basically, let's look at Asian action films, specifically kind of ones from Hong Kong and Korea that had a lot of cool scenes in them. The two that were really big inspirations was the Hong Kong movie Hard Boiled and the Korean movie Old Boy. And one of the really cool things about these is they have these, what they call one-shots, where the camera just keeps panning while the guy does something awesome. And it gives you movement through the scene, which is what that other white box level was lacking. So this kind of solved the movement problem for us if we could develop a white box prototype that kind of continually moved you through the scene, and we wanted you to kind of, you know, take on the first guy, grab his gun, shoot the next guy, take his baton, beat the next guy, kind of chain that together while moving through a scene to keep it interesting. We even played with getting a little bit more dynamic. You know, you don't have to always go in a straight line. You can kind of turn corners, but one of the things we learned pretty fast is if you do a corner turn as fast as that, you're going to make the player barf because they feel like they're being whipped around on a merry-go-round or something like that. So we learned some lessons, but they weren't all directly applicable. So the advantages of the Asian action film were we kind of moved through the environment and keep things interesting. And it was constrained in terms of the content and animation and AI, because even though it was a kind of long level, we knew exactly what we had to build, and we didn't have to fill out this kind of gigantic level with a bunch of content that we didn't necessarily have the time to create. And it also kind of gave us our first prototype of the chaining gameplay, which was kind of one of the essential features of Bullet Train later on. So we prototyped that with the player kind of moving through the scene and then attacking people and going on to the next person, then attacking them. But we kind of ran into some problems in practice. So this is my very bad programmer art of how the Oculus tracking system works up. This is the rotund player. They've got a headset on here, and then they have two motion controllers in here. And against the wall, there's two tracking cameras over there, and these are their kind of view frustrums. So as long as you have line of sight between one of the trackers and all the points on there, you can track the motion controllers and the headset, no problem. So when the players were sitting there and kind of beating up the guys in front of them, it was great. It worked out fine. But the problem was, since they were moving through the scene, they start beating up this guy, and they keep moving, they can't stop, and they start turning like this. And as soon as you kind of turn to the side, if the trackers are up here, this hand is obscuring this hand, and you lose tracking in the right. So that's kind of a deal breaker for us right there, because as soon as you lose hand tracking, it becomes no fun. It's no fun when your hand just kind of disappears randomly. It's another one of those things that just kind of pops you out of the experience. So we couldn't do that directly, but we did learn a few things. We learned that basically if you move through the scene, it keeps it much more fresh and interesting. And like in Showdown, if you're very careful with how you move the player through the scene, you can keep them moving around. And the secret we found to that is not to start them from a stop and go forward, but to fade the camera in from black while they're already moving. And that keeps them much more comfortable. And then we also learned that we need to, because of the tracking limitations, we need to be very, very cognizant of the way the player is facing in the real world. So we learned something, but what now? And I'm going to kind of speed through because we're running out of time a little bit. Basically, we wanted to take the best parts of that stationary shooter and the Asian action film prototype and then throw all the rules out the window. And we decided what we needed to do, since you're kind of a set of disembodied hands in Bullet Train anyway, why not let you teleport around? And this kind of gives us direct control over where people go. It limits the content needed because we know exactly where the player can be in the scene. And it controls the direction they're facing. And more importantly, people aren't kind of used to being shot at, so it's less overwhelming to the players. So if you look at Bullet Train from above, we added these teleport locations where all the arrows are. And you'll notice that they're all facing towards the center. And that's because we try to keep the action in the center so that the player, whenever they teleport, is always facing the action. So they're never tempted to turn to the left or the right, where they might lose tracking. So it's a very kind of simple, low-tech solution to a very kind of complex problem. And it works for the most part, but when you're kind of teleporting people through a scene, there's a few tricks you kind of need to do to make it feel right. So the teleporter blink was something we added to it. It's kind of a brief fade to white when the player cues. So you point at a teleporter location and the camera fades out to white, and we have a sound that kind of goes whoosh, and then we left a kind of trail behind the player, and that helped them get grounded in their new location. Since you're always teleporting across the map, and you're reorienting, I'm going to teleport from here basically to over here. Humans aren't very used to kind of changing the direction 180 degrees, so we had to hint as much as possible about where you came from. So we left a little zippy trail behind them to help them see where they had come from. I'm actually just going to skip that because we're almost out of time. So kind of going to the gameplay and polishing section, basically what we wanted to do now that we had the kind of root of the thing figured out, we really wanted to figure out how to make you feel like a badass. Basically, we wanted you to feel like Neo. And we decided early on, since a lot of people that were trying Bullet Train hadn't actually used VR before, and most importantly, almost nobody had used motion controllers before, we just wanted to take failure out of the equation. We didn't want to make it a game where you could die, because that's profoundly disappointing. So we decided you'll never die. Exactly. You'll never die. You'll only become more badass and more do more cool things. So you can take bullets that rockets don't damage you. You can grab rockets out of the air, throw them back. And we had to add a lot of invisible helpers, because we noticed when people were in there, if they grabbed something and threw it, if they missed it, it was kind of profoundly disappointing. Going back to that playtest loop, people would always be like, oh, I missed. And not a lot of people were very good at throwing things, so we added a lot of invisible helpers. The lesson we kind of learned from that is you can add to helpers, but nobody wants to be coddled. This is the goat from Jurassic Park, and you remember he's kind of tied up in the beginning, and the T-Rex gets super pissed off because he doesn't want to chase the goat that's tied up. He wants to go hunt real prey. And people just don't have a lot of fun when they don't feel like they've earned it. So the key that we learned with Bullet Train and all the interactions that make you feel like a badass is that we have to help you, but we can't make it obvious that it helps you. One of the biggest areas that people kind of failed with, you saw in the beginning trailer that people grab rockets out of the air and you throw them back at the boss. Some people kind of got that, and other people failed spectacularly. So the idea, again, with programmer art here, is that you encounter the boss shoots a rocket, you grab the rocket, and then you let it go and you shoot it at the boss. And it's kind of a simple interaction. Here's what it looks like in practice.
And aim them at the enemy.
It goes back like that. And that worked great when all of the game designers played the game. But when other people played, it kind of ended up more like that. To just throw the rockets right down in front of them, and they would explode. And through playtesting, we watched people, and when they failed, most often, instead of just letting the rocket go, they were trying to throw it like a football. So we said, hey, what's the solution to that? Let's let them throw it like a football. So we kind of changed the mechanics of rocket throwing, so the player grabs the rocket, and then we average the velocity of the rocket as they throw it over the past few frames to kind of get the intent of where they want to throw it, and then add some visual flourishes to kind of mask the fact that we were going to help them out. So if you throw the rocket like that, it kind of wobbles back and forth and looks like it's trying to regain control. And that got most of the people most of the way there. But some people, Brendan Rude, who's the CEO of Oculus, still doesn't the target. So we had to figure out something else. So they kind of still kind of were driving them into the ground. So we figured, what if we added a little bit of aim assist to it, so that when they threw it, it kind of peaked up, and then we would increase that aim assist as they kept trying and failing. So that the key to making it feel like it's not helping you, though, is to have the aim assist delayed when you start. So every time he throws the rocket, it's always starting out, and the first time they fail spectacularly, so they feel like, oh, I'm not good at this. And then they kind of get more, as we turn up the aim assist, the more and more times they try it, they eventually feel like, oh man, that's actually gotten better. When in fact, they still suck. So the philosophy from now is kind of the longer you suck, the less you suck. And to sum it up, basically what you want to do is you meet the player's expectations, right? You don't want to have them throw the rocket and hit every time, because that's not what they expect to happen. They expect to throw it and miss a few times and get better at it. Everybody expects as they do things, they kind of start succeeding more and more. And the key to that really is the play testing. Watch when they think that they're going to feel good about their action and when they're disappointed. And again, the biggest pro tip I can give you guys is they won't often actually tell you directly. Watch the face, watch the expressions, watch the body language, and that's really the key. So in summary, as you can tell, the road to a great VR experience, or probably an AR experience as well, is paved with poor choices and revision. That's really the secret to it. I would encourage you guys, since you have such a short time frame, make it as democratic environment as you can. Let everybody contribute. Try as many things as possible, because the first 10 ideas never work out. Learn from others' mistakes. Take a look at what's out there. Play things. See what is fun, what's not fun. Look at where other people have failed and where other people have succeeded, and weigh those. Don't try to solve every problem in VR. A lot of people jump in like, I'm going to make the perfect VR experience, but what you really want to do is kind of focus on one problem in VR, like how do I move around the scene, or how do I use motion controllers to make a player feel like they're in the scene. Play test it as often as possible, 2-3 times a day if you can. And finally, rip off and adapt ideas from anywhere you can find them. A lot of great ideas come from Neil Stephenson's books. Actually, we read Diamond Age, which is his book after Snow Crash, hence Snow Crash, to get a lot of the ideas. Werner Vinge is another great author, that, especially with the AR stuff, Rainbow's End. Read those, see what's cool in there, and then try to build towards that, and use those as kind of aspirational reference points. And with that, that's it.
Questions?
Everybody wants to go to lunch.
So I have one. I was curious if how much thinking you guys have done about AR, and which of these lessons do you think would translate into AR, or which ones won't?
Well, a lot of the lessons that we learn from VR pertain directly to simulator sickness, which isn't as much of an issue in AR. But I think a lot of the meeting players' expectations and the constant play testing really do apply to AR, because AR is all about kind of augmenting something that's already there, and you really have to play to real-world expectations much more than you do in VR. In VR, you get to cheat because you're simulating the world. You define physics, you define the lighting and everything. In AR, you really have to play by the rules of the real world to some extent. You can't cheat all the time like we do in VR. So we're just getting started on making some cool VR applications, but one of the things that we really try to adapt is the constant play testing, the constant figuring out what people want to do, and then trying to meet those expectations rather than what we think they want to do, because they never, ever, ever, ever line up. Yep.
What are the best strategies you think, or like to develop an application? What do you think are the best strategies to go around it?
I think the best thing, like I said, is just try to get a lot of prototypes early on. Try 5 or 6 different ideas, because if you try one idea and you get down the path, especially on a 10-week project, you don't have that time to spend on it. You can't afford to go down a failure path. So just try it out as low fidelity as possible. It's so tempting to polish an idea and bring it to completion, when all you really need to do is build the first 20 or 30% of it to see if it has a lot of merit. So I would suggest, your first week in there, just make 5 crappy prototypes of whatever your application is, and see what works and what doesn't, and then use that to build upon, and then take the 1 or 2 best ideas and kind of merge them into the final application.
How large is your team that made these games?
So Bullet Train, the last one, it was me and a designer in North Carolina for the first 4 weeks, and then we scaled up to about 10 people for about 6 weeks. on there, and not all of them were full time. It was kind of people continually going in and out. Like I said, we bribe a lot of people with cases
And
of
most of
beer.
them
and
are
whiskey.
most of them are programmers, or
I was the only programmer on them. We tried to, that was kind of the democratizing the process. We used visual scripting really heavily, so the non-programmers on the team would kind of prototype a feature, and then I would take it and kind of clean it up and do the programmery things of making sure it works on a network, making sure it's performant, stuff like that. The hard problems that programmers are specialized in solving, I would try to focus my efforts on those while letting everybody else kind of just throw ideas at the wall.
So in these demos you made, you worked a lot with designers.
Yeah.
So I don't know how many of us are designers. Like what kind of advice would you have for the kind of team compositions that we'll have to try to get the most out of our experience?
So I think you don't have designers, so try to hedge your bets with buying content from other places. Use the marketplace, use TurboSquid, all those sorts of things. But I think even programmers have a very good sense of user experience and stuff. So try to take those lessons. What you're really doing, especially in AR, is building a user experience around a certain piece of technology. So where you're shorthanded, buy and steal as much as you can. And then use the fact that you guys are all programmers is an amazing advantage, because you can prototype the ideas with a lot less friction than it would take a designer to. So in a lot of ways, you've got the prototyping phase down a lot better than we do at Epic, because you guys have a lot more bandwidth to try that stuff. So I would leverage against that, whereas we were kind of leveraging more against the content that we had.
How do you organize and search through reusable content? There's got to be like a million models in your repository. How do you find the one that fits?
The answer is very mundane, but it's basically we just talk to the guys that made the project. It's very much what we call sneaker net, right? You go talk to the guy that made the tech demo and say, hey, is there anything cool we can steal from this? This is kind of what we're going for. Most of the development actually happens, I would say, at lunchtime, when people are going out to lunch and just talking to people randomly about what they're doing. Saying, oh yeah, that demo we made 2 years ago, we had this other cool thing, maybe you can take that. So we just kind of, again, beg, borrow, and steal that. It's all organized in our source code repository. We use Purpose. So there's some semblance of where things are. It's easy once you know that it exists to go find it, but we really don't have a very good solution for I need a robot model to find it. I would love it if there was, though. It made my life a lot easier.
All right.
Yeah,
Well,
cool.
thanks again.